Hello, everybody. Hi, thanks for joining and welcome to another Sales Hacker webinar. I'm your host today, Colin Campbell. I'm the Director of Marketing at Sales Hacker. And today we are talking about revenue operations or RevOps, somewhat new function, or in some cases, an actual team or organization in the sales industry. It's growing really, really quickly. I think last year on LinkedIn, revenue operations titles were the fastest growing title in sales. So this is a big new thing, and we're all kind of trying to figure out what best practices are. And I don't know if we have solid best practices yet, but we have definitely learned a lot about what doesn't work and what does work. And so to do that today, we're going to give you a framework that you can use to align all of your revenue teams around the same philosophies, processes, insights, and understanding about your buyers, even tools. So to do that, I'm joined by two true pros. So first of all, Erin Bush, and she's the Senior Director of Revenue Operations at LeanData. Erin, thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thanks, Colin.
Psyched to have you here because we ran, to those of you who don't know, LeanData and Sales Hacker teamed up about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, to run a survey of the state of the revenue operations industry. And I think we now have the biggest data set around all of the questions you could ask about what is RevOps right now. We've got some of those findings to actually share with you today. You're the first people to see them. So that's exciting. But then we're also going to hear some of your story, right, Erin?
We are, yes. We're going to talk about how we do revenue operations at LeanData and a little bit about some of what we've heard back from the market in the survey.
So exciting. And to pair that up, so we're all learning from a couple different places right now. We also have Marcus Benning, who is the Vice President of Revenue Operations at Outreach. Marcus, welcome to you as well.
Great to be here. Hi, Colin. Hello, everyone.
We're excited. So here's what we do on these live webinars, and hopefully if you're joining this webinar, you know this, but if you're in the live one, if you're not watching the recording, you're here live for a reason, right? Like you're here to ask some questions, to solve some problems that you have. So Marcus and Erin are going to share their stories. They're going to share what they've learned and maybe share what they still don't know. We can work on that together as a group. You can do the same thing, right? So right now, do me a favor, everybody open up the chat, the little at the bottom of the screen, the little chat thing. Make sure your visibility is set to all panelists and attendees so we can all see what we're asking and talking about. We have a discussion here. And please just start by introducing yourself. If you have a question that you know you want answered about RevOps, you can throw that in there now and I'll hang on to it. We're gonna try to answer as many questions on the topic today as we can, but let's start. Let us know who's here with us in the chat box. And while you're all doing that, I'll just remind you, as always, we are recording this. So if you have to step away for any reason, or you just think this is awesome stuff, because it is, and you want to share it with your team, you're going to have the recording and you'll be able to do that. And the deck too. All right, so we've got Joe. Joe is always here. Hey, Joe, thanks for joining again. Joe is like the ultimate Sales Hacker community member. Ask great questions. Andrew Garcia, he's an AE at, where'd you go, Andrew? In Annapolis, okay. Hey, Andrew. Stephen Palange at TLIC Worldwide. Eunice, Carl from Mountain View, Wyoming. Ooh, I wish I was in Wyoming. I like being in the middle of nowhere. I don't know about everybody else. Melanie from Boulder. Lavisa Haglund from Yo-Yo Wallet. Danny Bray, who's a senior manager of global demand enablement in Chicago. Really good mix here. Seth is a VP of RevOps at Karis. Hi, Seth. All right, this is a great team. And so you all are welcome to use that chat box to talk to each other. I'm gonna keep a really close eye on it. So if you ask a question to Mark or Erin, I'll make sure we get an answer. Let's jump into it. What we're talking about is RevOps. We're talking about it because it's fast growing and we're all kind of still figuring it out. Erin, can you walk us a little bit through about how we're going to cover this topic today?
Yes, so we have a handful of topics that we're going to try to cover. It's a pretty wide scope, so definitely jump in if you want us to pause and dive deeper into any of these topics. The first thing is that we're going to define what revenue operations means. Marcus and I will share what it means to each of us. We'll talk about why revenue operations and why now. That's some of the results from the survey of what we're seeing in other parts of the market. We'll dive into how LeanData does revenue operations, how Outreach does revenue operations, and then a couple of key takeaways for how to implement revenue operations at your organization. So starting off with defining revenue operations. So this is how we think about state of the market. It's complicated. So this is for your teams as well as for your customers. They're dealing with a number of different channels. Marketing is doing their thing, sales is doing their thing. It's complex and it's hard to coordinate. Marcus, any thoughts just starting there?
Yeah, thanks, Erin, and great to be here. Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening in. I was really looking forward to this opportunity because I really appreciate what Sales Hacker is doing for everyone, and just bringing this topic up is so exciting. This complexity, Erin, is actually why I'm in revenue operations. I love it because you can always attach different areas of solution approaches to each of these aspects. For example, just pick social. Right? How relevant is it, and where do you best insert it into the sales motion or even in the marketing motion? Digital content by itself alone is such an important subject, and it all needs to come together. And that's what revenue ops is about, to kind of slice and dice the problem and look at all these things. And there are different approaches. We use the term funnel kind of to make sense of this complexity, and we'll hear a little bit about that later.
Awesome. Totally agree. And based on this, because it's so complex and we're all doing so many different things across our various revenue teams, there are consequences when they're not aligned. This is coming back to, the topic that's been talked about forever about marketing and sales alignment, but it's really bigger than that your entire customer experience, if it's not built and connected in the right way, can have an impact on your actual revenue growth. And this is where we care about the business impact and what we're doing. So that's where we are, and that's the issue with the status quo. But what's the solution? We believe that having revenue operations as alignment across all of your teams is the solution. So this means marketing operations, partner operations, customer success, your traditional sales operations. That's probably the most well-known among sales teams, but coordinating those under a revenue operations function is how to approach the solution.
So we had a really great, just clarifying question from Andrew Garcia. He was basically saying in its simplest form, and before he saw that slide, that revenue ops is sales and marketing alignment, which I think that was kind of the genesis of revenue operations. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say two things to this. One is, it doesn't matter where you start. For example, you could take a very sales ops centric approach, which is the one we took. But if you, for example, launch this from a very strongly and well run marketing operations function, and you just basically then connect the dots horizontally, that's also fine. The only additional comment I would make is, for us at Outreach, sales development is very, very important. So we actually have a fourth pillar that we look at, which is sales development operations. And companies might look at this differently. You could even, for example, look at support operations as part of the customer success function as another pillar. The most important thing here is the must bust, right? It's really about kind of, instead of going vertical, thinking horizontal and connecting the dots.
That's a great insight. I love that point.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I've seen companies, I used to be in sales operations and seen companies come at this from different angles as well, where from sales operations, I was seeing that other teams were buying the same systems that we already had instead of having, one system that we all used. And that was one angle. Another was, seeing how marketing was approaching identifying our target market, which was different from how sales was approaching target accounts. And that was a way to align. So from all of these different perspectives, you can figure out how to create alignment. And this just illustrates that we all do planning, we all have our process, we all use tools, and connecting those across the entire go-to-market team is a way to make this work.
Yeah, and that just quick addition to that, Erin. It's a wonderful slide to also talk about the customer journey, because customers, they don't buy in those vertical terms, right? They look at how can they best kind of put their expected experience into practice by looking at a company that thinks about the customer journey in a holistic way. And that means effectively having to connect. It's almost like your customers are asking you to think and operate in that way, because otherwise you're not going to be able to give any customer or prospect that answer, which is, hey, we care for you from the very beginning to hopefully the initial deal close and then beyond into the wonderful journey of expansion and renewals. That's kind of what drives, I think, the most natural horizontalization, I would say, of these vertical silos.
Right, 100%, where we have to be aligned that if I'm a customer and I go to your event, it would be a terrible experience to get a call from sales development not knowing that I'm a customer. Or, if I go through discovery and then I go to implementation, I would want them to have all of the information from discovery and just a smooth process for me as a customer. So we've turned to the experts, Serious Decisions and Topo, and we're hearing a lot of the same things, that revenue operations is essential for teams to deliver the results for revenue as well as for their customer. So that sort of translates into why now. After talking to those experts and researchers, we wanted to talk to our peers and understand what everyone else was seeing. So in partnership with Sales Hacker, we put together this survey and we got some really interesting results. So about 2,500 respondents. As Colin was saying, this is probably the largest data set to date on revenue operations. And we're seeing enormous growth. So between last year's survey and this year's, we're seeing 55% growth in terms of if they actually have revenue operations as a function, and even more growth in terms of if it's being built. And Marcus, I know that you'll dive into later your evolution of building this out, but any comments on what you're seeing in your partners and customers too?
Yeah, this is fascinating, right? If every time you see high double digits growth, it kind of gets exciting, right? First of all, everybody's talking about revenue ops, and now it's getting interesting in regards of really making sense of it. We're getting from the moment of, okay, starting a year ago, roughly, it was kind of a buzzword. Now we're starting to get together and make sense of it, and every company kind of needs to find their own approach to this. There's no silver bullet. But the simple fact of speaking about revenue operations in a connected way, I think that's what we're talking about here. And that's incredibly encouraging. That what this means is that companies are thinking in terms of the customer lifecycle and translating that thinking into the way they operate internally together to and with those prospects and customers. And I think that's the fundamental change that we're seeing.
Yeah, that's a good transition too, because we did ask questions about why are we seeing this growth, and some of it is around challenges in creating consistent revenue growth, that people are turning to these ideas to try to solve for, and also, as you said, that creating a seamless customer experience across their entire buyer journey is imperative for companies to figure out, and that requires this alignment. And then, just to wrap it up, that once you do create alignment across all of your revenue and go-to-market teams, you do see benefits for each team. So, for sales, faster growth, for marketing, alignment with sales, and then for customer success as well. So I put together a little bit about how we do revenue operations at LeanData. We talk about this for our customers all the time, that we enable our customers to, build their revenue operations, but what do we actually do? So we look at it through this framework where planning, execution, and analytics are the key areas that we look at. So starting with planning, who is our target customer? What sort of geography, company size, industry, all of those things. And then how do we connect with them? So this connects what marketing is probably doing in terms of identifying, accounts for them to nurture, and what sales development is doing and how they reach out. We found when I joined that there wasn't complete alignment on that front. And so we put planning as a key part of this, that our marketing and sales teams plan together. And then execution, we'll dive a little bit more in detail here, but this is really all of the handoffs across the customer lifecycle. And then looking at those transition points, what are the things that you're measuring to see what's working, what's not working? How do you improve over time?
And Erin, before we dive into like these different pieces and your journey start to finish, can you just give us a sense of timeline here? Like, how long are you taking as a team to do each of these three things, and how far along in your journey do you think you are now?
Oh, that's a good question. So go-to-market planning we're doing right now for the next calendar year. We run on a calendar year, and it's an iterative process, really. So it's happened over the last couple of months where we're putting together, here's what we believe the plan should be for the coming year, and then get feedback from each of the revenue teams until we, by the end of this week, we'll have a final plan. So it does take a little bit of time to coordinate that planning. But in terms of the evolution to a streamlined revenue operations framework, I think we're probably 70% of the way. There's always more to do. And then as things change, as the team grows, continuing to iterate on our process.
And that 70% of the way is a journey across more than one calendar year, I assume.
It is, yes. This is something that was started definitely before I got to LeanData in 2018, and something that's been my main focus over the last about year and a half.
Okay. So potentially a long road, requires a lot of focus and a lot of cross-departmental cooperations and efforts, but you're doing it in these like leapfrog motions where you're not trying to sprint to 100% right away. You're like, what can I do first, and then iterate on?
It's more how we do our regular functions, right? Back to the early slide about marketing, sales, and CS, how they all have planning. So now we're doing planning, but how do we connect the dots between those functions when we do planning? We're measuring performance for marketing, sales development, sales, customer success. How do we build an aligned set of metrics that everyone buys into and everyone tracks over time? So it's our same business functions, but doing them in a more connected way.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great point, Colin. I would add that planning never stops, really, right? So right now, of course, everyone in operations kind of moves forward. We're in Q4, whether it ends in December or in January. So basically a hot time for planning. But then you think you can go kind of start the fiscal year and say, okay, now we're going into execution. But really, you're kind of starting to validate your planning assumptions right away. And then if you are, thankfully, as we are in a very high growth environment, that leads to kind of constantly asking yourself whether those assumptions really are happening, and then measuring where the analytics piece comes in. So that's an ongoing function that you need to have to kind of validate, hey, did the planning actually make sense? And then you have to be able to quickly react and make adjustments, which is where you rely on the execution piece, right? So you want to have set up something that is actually, and we for example use the term, we try to stay away from being perfect, and it's interesting for an operations person to say that, but we actually actively try to not be perfect, because it takes too much time, and it takes away degrees of freedom and flexibility that you need to be successful in connecting these three things.
Yes, absolutely. That it's a constant cycle where we'll plan. We will build out and execute on that plan, and then we'll measure it, and then we'll keep going back. Yep.
Yeah.
Great point.
So that's exactly what we were talking about, building out our plan. Who is our ideal customer? How do we identify our personas? And this, in really basic human terms, what problem do we solve? Who do we solve it for? How do we tell that story? Bringing in all of the hard work that our product team and our product marketing team are doing, and then passing that down across our go-to-market steps. And then, our execution, this is really where technology comes in, where we have this plan and how do we make that work? Do we have people doing all of these handoff steps? What can we automate? How do we build, a seamless process for the customer that we can ensure that things are accurate and smooth and that we're capturing data throughout everything that we do? And then the execution also has a people aspect. So we, like you said, Marcus, growing really quickly, hiring a bunch of people. How do we make sure that they are onboarded, that, as we roll out new products, that the message is getting out to the field? So making sure that we are enabling all of our teams to work together as well. And then analytics, so creating performance metrics across each of the checkpoints that we talked about, and then how do we see what's working? So we use marketing attribution to see ROI for our campaigns and measuring what's working, what do we do more of, what do we do less of, continuing to improve over time. And then this is really the last piece. This is where I started in operations, that one tech stack. We are one connected team, that we don't just have marketing tools and sales tools and customer success tools. We have one tech stack. Everything talks to the central point, which for us is our CRM, and we make sure that these handoffs are seamless. And then we look at functions. So what function do we use for forecasting, for metrics? It all fits together.
So before we dive into your story, Marcus, one of the questions I get most frequently when I learn about RevOps from people, because I'm not teaching anybody about RevOps, I know next to nothing. But one of the things I hear people talking about most often, Erin, is like org structure and roles, since there's very few models to look at to say like, yes, that's how you build a RevOps team. Can you tell us a little bit about that people part, like your journey and how you see companies adding to the roster? Like, who's the first hire to the team, and what does your team look like now?
That is a really good question, and I don't know that there is one best way to do it. A lot of people are not in the same organization or reporting structure, but have to work together as a revenue operations function. So I would say that historically, it does start with either a centralized sales operations or marketing operations. But for me, I tend to look at the systems, and in hiring somebody that can own and manage our systems, and then the data. So that is both data inputs from your data sources, data inputs that you're gathering throughout the sales process and interactions with the customer, and then data analysis, and then enablement. So the strategy and planning aspect, systems and data, and enablement. So looking at them as functions and hiring the team according to those functions.
Okay, interesting. And yeah, how different is that from how you think about it? Like, where are you at?
Yeah, I would add to that, Erin, that's a cool approach. I would just add, what do we focus on when we look for talent for RevOps? And it in my experience, it comes down to two things. We need kind of collaborative problem solvers. We also need deliberate change agents. Mm-hmm. And if you find someone that combines that, then you have someone that you can build a team around. And from a background perspective, we look at experience, of course, in our case, software as a service world, high growth environments. The ability to connect the dots in regards of what makes sense from a process perspective. And then to your point, of course, the ability to understand how we use our tech stack in a way that it makes sense, and how do we continuously add additional layers of productivity into how we operate. Those are things we look for when we go hire. And we also we love to look at internal talent, right? People that have been growing successfully in the company and are looking for the next career step. I'm constantly, for example, on a sales motion internally and trying to find additional talent. As we grow as a company, we also need to grow RevOps, and there's nothing better than finding someone who has been successful in the business and then join the team. We had a recent fantastic case, very, very successful CSM joined our enablement team, and that's working out fantastically. So I want to encourage everyone, don't only look outside, look inside your own company. You will find fantastic talent right there at your doorstep.
That's a really good point. We were talking at the beginning about this being a pretty new function. I mean, I think it was maybe 3 years ago that I first heard about it. And so you won't find people with, 5 to 8 years in revenue operations. I've hired people internally from our marketing team, from sales development, especially sales development leadership. They're very process and technology aware, and from CS as well, that it is really that problem solving and process mindset, that if you want to solve a problem, you want to dive in and fix things, you're gonna be great.
I love that point about hiring internally, and we've got SS, so an anonymous attendee is cheering for the fact that you look for change agents. I imagine it would be easier for people who already have some internal relationships to kind of be that role. Is that the case, Marcus?
Yeah, absolutely, because you understand the inner fabric of the company that you're a part of, and you have built connections. The simple fact that you're able to look for a new role means that you have been successful in your prior role. Let's assume that. So you have some brand equity that you can bring to the table and address one thing that RevOps needs to have, which is very strong connections and partnerships, not only to the classic internal customer, which is the go-to-market team or the revenue team, however you call it, but also beyond that, finance. If I think about product marketing or even product management, those are very, very important connections. So if you can go and attract talent from those places, that's fantastic, because it just gives you that additional velocity in regards of making those connections real.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so actually, we have a really good question that I'll get to. So Jeffrey, can't see your last name, Jeffrey Schmelzer asks, and great question, Jeffrey. Any tips on getting sales and BDR teams to buy into operations and processes? So on the flip side of the coin, we know that there are challenges. Well, how do you get around that? And what makes a successful change agent?
Now, Marcus, do you want to start? You guys are really a well-known SDR team. How do you guys do it?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Thanks, Jeffrey. So there's so many things that come to mind. One is if the common denominator is always, how do I measure the business in a way that it makes sense and is focused on outcomes, and how do I stay away from what is known as vanity metrics, right? So, but rather, how do I measure outcomes? And I think that's a great connection point. So, for example, back to Erin's point about planning being so important, in the planning phase, incorporating that BDR and sales leadership in your case, Jeffrey, and making sure that we are empathetic to how they think about the business and what they worry about and what are they concerned about, and we that we go in a very collaborative way at the business problem that we need to solve, which is putting a business plan together. Incorporating and working with those stakeholders from early on will lead to that buy-in, because people feel heard and they feel a part of the process. That in my experience is super important for any stakeholder, right? So sales, BDR, also customer success. The more time you invest in really listening and understanding how their process works and what are their concerns and what's not working, the better outcomes you will have at the end, because ultimately when it comes after a new process design and after implementation of a new technology, it comes to enablement, and that enablement will only be as successful as you have being able to achieve buy-in from the get-go. So you need to basically think downstream and involve people early. That would be my recipe, and try to talk one language.
And I would add to that, especially your last point about speaking one language, that we're all on the same team. We have different functions within the team, but we're all driving toward the same goal. So we're not going to put a process or a tool in place that's going to impede, what a sales development team is doing. We're going to do the things that are going to help them to be the most effective to achieve or beat their goals. That's my goal, is to make them very successful, save them time, all of those things. So, we're there to assist them and to help them build their careers. And I think that once you're on that page and that mindset, everyone really gets it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to add, kind of one of my favorite words is empathy. And again, sounds kind of strange, right? An operations person talking about empathy, but to us, it's actually critical. Empathy about the business, about the people that run the business, about quota carrying sales roles. Those roles are under enormous pressure to deliver, and we just need to take that extra step to understand how their day looks like. So, for example, something that we try to do is shadow and spend time together with our stakeholders and internal customers and friends, and just really try to understand what's going on. That leads to mutual respect, because we do spend that time to actively listen. And then also it's a win-win because we do understand the process better. And so when it comes to solving an issue, we're much faster, much better connected. So if you just have that positive win-win mindset as you engage with your stakeholders, in Jeffrey's case, sales and BDR teams, but actually that works for everyone, then you will achieve those results. Now, you need to be aware that that takes additional cycles. It's not a traditional way of running ops through an empathetic way. You need to work that into your internal operating model to really have those time frames defined, whether so that you can actually plan projects, for example, with the associated or appropriate amount of time to really understand what the business cares about, so you can work that into your solution approach in a complete manner.
These are all great insights. And one of the things that you said earlier, Marcus, was to kind of start with, it's like I'm going to twist your words a little bit, but you reminded me of Simon Sinek when you said, think about your results first. In like, building support throughout these organizations. Because if you start with the why, like Simon Sinek is always talking about, then you have a reason to be talking to them, and you can point to that instead of just trying to walk in and say, this is the process, now do it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that I'm curious about, so Erin, you just told us a little bit about your journey and where you're at. You say you're maybe like 70% of the way through your journey, your RevOps journey. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, so I'm sorry. But I'm so curious. So at 70% of the way through, like what results do you point to, and how do you know you're on the right track?
Oh, that's a good point, or good question. In terms of things that I look at, that I just, use to pull that number out of the air, or things that we have aligned on. For example, we have aligned on what is our ideal customer. That marketing and sales development are looking at the same target list for customers that we want to connect with. So just like key sort of milestones along the way. But then the things that we measure to see if that's working is we've built out our plan to say, this is our revenue goal. To get there, we know conversion rates and deal sizes. This is our pipeline goal. And to get to our pipeline, what are our leading indicator metrics? Those are the things that we measure. Are we hitting our pipeline goals? Are we growing as a company the way that we need to? That's how we track it.
Really interesting. Okay, so there's some important mile markers. Ryan Delaney has a great question as well. And I put this to both of you really quick, and then maybe we can dive into your story, Marcus. So this is the last question before let's hear about Outreach's journey. But we can still take more questions, guys, don't worry. So question is, at what point in the life cycle of a company does it make sense to start pushing for alignment? We all know very early stages, we kind of just got to do things, get things done. At what point do you start trying to build in this intentionality and a little more structure and process?
If I can start with this one, if that's okay, Marcus. I would say that start with this mindset from the beginning, right? You might not have an ops person. It might just be you've hired one person in sales. You're a very small startup. Start with the idea that your go-to-market process and your customer journey are connected all the way across. And that's how you build it out from the beginning. And then when you hire somebody to run your CRM, run your marketing automation system, they will follow along in that, rather than what I think a lot of companies did in the last 2-3 years was you have established functions and you have to figure out how to align them, and then you're unraveling what's already in place.
Yeah, great point there. I would add, totally aligned. Yeah, it's a mindset, right? You need to think in terms of the customer life cycle. And as for when do you make organizational changes, I think that's a question of scale. When you are, you can maybe associate it in the SaaS world, a revenue market to this. So usually experience shows that you can get to 25 million with kind of a relatively improvisational approach, but then it will get more and more difficult to kind of keep things flowing with scale. So then you start automatically looking at the number of times a repeated issue comes up, and when you address it maybe in a very opportunistic way, you solve it, but you don't solve for the future. And if you start thinking in terms of that next milestone from a revenue growth perspective, it's always important to kind of connect that to how are we solving the problem, and are we solving it for scale? And once you start asking yourself that question, that's the moment when you need to start thinking in terms of also potentially formalizing the organization into one revenue ops org. Now that having said that, it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't really formally depend on having an organizational alignment, meaning changing reporting lines, because that's difficult. It's more about establishing that connected thinking and making sure that, for example, when you define measurements and metrics and KPIs about the business, that you don't do so in a siloed and kind of sliced way, but rather look at, okay, how does it support the overall growth target, which is in our case growing ARR, and how does that metric connect from a relevancy and business impact perspective to the overarching goal? And when you start asking those questions, then actually you're basically putting RevOps into practice without formally even sometimes noticing it. But that's actually revenue operations, because you're connecting everything back to the ultimate outcome, which is revenue growth. And you then starting to ask questions: how can we tweak the process? How can we improve the usage of our tech stack? Oh, we need to get better at enablement. Let's focus on that. And then you realize, well, enablement is actually directly connected to how you define the processes. So all of these questions lead to sometimes even a non-formal implementation approach toward RevOps.
I love the way you think about this. Both of you have such they're so similar, but there are these nuanced differences to how you talk and think about it. And I think it's fascinating. And I think I'm starting to get a sense, Marcus, for what your journey has been at Outreach, but maybe it's time to dive into that and tell us a little bit about, where you start, where you end up, how you guys are operationalizing this.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I started at Outreach a little bit over a year ago, and found can we go to the next slide? There we go. Love that picture, by the way. So I found a classic sales ops team that was really working with sales development, sales, and customer success, but we were called sales ops. So as part of my discovery and trying to build connections, I started to find out that, well, it has always been sales ops and nobody really thought about it, but we were kind of sort of solving problems already across the funnel. So that was great. Enablement was running separately, directly working for the CRO. And there were some issues with that, because if you don't have that process level connection, then we had issues around relevancy and communications, and addressing certain specific aspects that were only relevant for one role, but not thinking kind of horizontally across the process, for example, right? Marketing ops was separate, but had a close connection. There were no issues there. And we definitely had, and I realized that quickly, what I call an insights deficit. So reports were made available, and we had also cool looking dashboards, but where was the connectedness from a relevancy perspective? So how did we really enable certain personas in a structured way to help them make decisions faster? It was very tactical, right? We could operate, and we were producing a forecast, and actually with remarkable accuracy. But the question that came up quickly: would this allow us to scale? And we were, and still are, thankfully growing very fast. We had ops roles in the team, defined at what I call vertically. So focused on, here's a program manager that focuses on sales operations, and here's a program manager that really focuses and knows the CSPs well. But the question comes up: are they really effectively talking to each other, right? And certain topics like, for example, account planning, you would think that account planning is a sales thing. It actually is not, because you need to actually think in terms of the sales process and the customer success process to put together an account planning motion that makes sense. And we actually had that issue when we started to formalize account planning. And that's just one example where you really benefit from connecting things across the funnel to solve, to come up with better solutions. Then we were pretty efficient. We still are in solving problems. We call it the whirlwind. We actually gave it a name. So how good are we in actually addressing and working in the whirlwind? Of course, the word fire drill comes to mind. I mean, everybody in ops loves or hates that word. And the question that I faced was, okay, we're running some quick priority projects, but how are they all connected to make us better with scale, right? And that then leads to the next slide, where I'm summarizing a little bit about where we are today. So, or how did we get there? We rebranded ourselves as RevOps, so that was kind of one of the first things I did, because I realized, hey, we're doing sales development ops and sales ops and customer success ops, so let's call ourselves RevOps. And it started with really just a branding exercise. And yes, we had cool T-shirts made. By the way, they're super popular internally, so everybody wants to have our T-shirts, which we love. And we integrated enablement into RevOps, and are actually now on a very, very fast path of rebuilding that function and making it more relevant to addressing all the different elements that are relevant to enablement, which is onboarding, ongoing learning and development, and then the content piece. And of course, how to use the sales stack effectively. We established SLAs with each of our business partners, and in particular with marketing ops, and kind of came together and, for example, started an effort to develop our quarterly goals together. That was very successful. We're right now actually incubating and formalizing a new insights function. So when I made the plan, I actually said, okay, insights comes last. We kind of modeling through on that front, but we definitely need to have a dedicated role. We're actually in the hiring process right now to find our insights leader, who then engages across the organization with key stakeholders, builds the story, actually incubates that function so that we can deliver insights in a more targeted way and also enable decision-making in a better way than today. And today we're actually looking at defining ops roles with process steps, right? So we have, when we talk about the process, for example, lead to opportunity, opportunity to quote, and so on, we want to have folks in the team that actually own that, so that we also have a clear go-to model in regards of our stakeholders knowing, oh, I have an issue in regards of my MQL to SQL conversion rate. Well, who do I go to? Well, I would go to the ops person that is the champion for that lead to opportunity process. Or, hey, we want to improve visibility of our renewal forecast and actually embed that into our Salesforce dashboards. Who do I talk to? Well, I go talk to the ops person that owns the adopt to renew expand process, who then is on point to bring in other stakeholders, like, for example, our BI team, because we work across teams and very collaboratively to produce, for example, those insights with our Tableau dashboards. So that I think number 5 is the change that I think was most difficult to implement, but also the most fun, and actually is bringing the best dividends, because it just breaks silos, right? It says, okay, look, for example, when we talk about quote to order and order to onboard, that sounds like it's just a process statement, but you have a very strong finance connection there, and the deal desk is actually associated to that. So you want to make sure that the revenue ops team always thinks kind of with a very broad horizon and thinking, okay, what does finance need to know? Why do I need to know how the bookings policy really looks like, so that I can actually make it work from a process perspective? So we, for example, define the process from the early on. When we put a quote together, we need to know how the bookings policy looks, because if we don't do that the right way, we're going to have to problem solve a lot at the end of the process. So that thinking, that was a ton of fun to implement. We're still working on that, by the way. And then I mentioned it already, key partnerships, building strategic partnerships, and also investing the time to really understand, for example, what is the finance team going at from a project and prioritization perspective. Product marketing is another key one. Just enablement, connecting with product marketing is absolutely critical. We actually have a model now where we actually jointly execute key projects. Foundational projects, for example, recently introduced a contract management system. We ran that project together with finance in very, very close alignment, and that was a great experience because it allowed us to kind of connect the dots from a financial process perspective, and then also improve the deal desk function on that same journey. So journey never stops, but those are kind of a couple of things we learned. And I always say we focus on 4 functions, right? And this is what we need to build. And we have kind of the first 3, so process enablement, system and tools in place. And we're working on data and insights to actually formalize that as one role. And why do we do this? Because again, process that's the bread and butter, what I say, what I call bread and butter of operations. We want to be excellent. We have to be ready for scale. We want to be consistent. We constantly want to innovate. This is where we kind of focus on the planning process that Erin mentioned earlier. This is where we manage change projects. And this is also where we drive what we call the rhythm of the business, which is the classic pipeline management and forecasting fun across the funnel. Then the enablement team is all about productivity. Everything that the enablement team does needs to be focused on productivity gains and wins, both for the participants, but also for the overall organization. And this is about the 3 things I already mentioned: onboarding, learning and development, and then content management and effective delivery. You could add to that the effective usage of an LMS, but we're looking at that in the context of systems and tools, which is the next one. There, it's all about relevancy. How relevant are our tools? How do we increase weekly active usage? How do we measure that effectively? What's the user experience? For example, we recently ran a project just looking at how and of course we use Salesforce, how we improve the user experience around the account object in Salesforce. It was incredible to just see how a structured approach to listen to our users and then reduce 70% of the fields. We literally kicked out 70% of the fields, and then summarize the views and make them just more relevant and easy to use. So that's an example for a project that is driven by the systems and tools team, but of course drives process excellence, supports much quicker finding of account information. The enablement team was engaged because they helped us roll out that newness, and that leads to kind of a much better user experience. And then data and insights, that's all about stories, right? How do we make sense of data, connect the dots, create the contextual relevancy, and support our decision makers to make better decisions faster? And that's kind of our construction zone right now. So I should have added kind of a little yellow helmet there, because we're building that. And it's a great learning experience because everybody wants to be part of it. It's extremely popular to talk about data nowadays, and especially if you talk about data in the context of telling stories, because reports, everybody has reports, but do you have good stories? And that's the question we want to solve. And then finally, because we want to allow enough time for questions, this is kind of how we look at it: full funnel revenue operations. We really mean it. And this is taken from our friends at Winning by Design. I kind of love that model where they use kind of the bow tie. Everybody has seen it. We really try to make revenue operations about those aspects, and try to introduce clever measurements into the process, and then say, okay, why is it relevant to have a good MQL SQL conversion rate? Well, because it supports the overall effectiveness of this funnel. Right. It also allows us to kind of reflect how our customers actually engage with us. We're very proud of our customer obsession, and we also translate that to who we want to be in RevOps here at Outreach. And it just becomes real because we have a story to tell for each of these aspects of the funnel. We just cannot say we're only about sell to close, which is the traditional sales ops focus. We have to be concerned about how are we impacting our customers when they adopt our software and implement new workflows, and how do we set up a successful expansion motion by giving the CSMs what they need to be successful, just to pick some examples. And all of that facilitates scaling, because the moment you turn the dial on any of these vertical connection points that you see across the funnel, you ultimately impact the end result, which is maximizing the lifetime value of the customer and its relevancy for the business overall.
I love those, those visuals you put to that, Marcus. That's a cool way to, you can see when you look at the bow tie and then you look at how you describe how you build roles, kind of with ownership tied to all of the different conversion points there, how it makes total sense and it maps to a better customer experience along from the first contact to 3 years into their contract with Outreach. So that's a really cool way to think about it. Just a heads up to everybody watching, we've got 8 minutes left. You still have time to squeeze in questions on this topic of like building a RevOps team or RevOps function, change management, anything like that. So if you have questions on that, feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, we've got some really solid takeaways here for you from Marcus and Erin.
All right, so really just pulling out some of the high points of what we've talked about so far, how to start on this revenue operations journey if you're not doing this in your team today. So first is really mapping out your go-to-market process. So, the target, engage, deliver idea where marketing would traditionally target, sales is engaging, customer experience is delivering. How do you map out that entire process and the handoffs there? And then within that, identifying opportunities for alignment. So this is really picking out some key projects that you might be able to execute outside of, changing your entire organizational structure. What can we do to create big wins quickly? So the ones that stick out to me are the go-to-market model, ICP, target personas. I think that's really valuable to show the connection. And then Marcus, you talked a lot about enablement. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, so enablement is so critical, right? It's also one of those new things, right? Companies talk about it in terms of training or field productivity or field readiness, whatever the name is. You ultimately need to have someone, or ideally a team, focused on adding productivity to everyone who touches prospects and customers. And that has to do with onboarding, right? So you need to have a great onboarding experience so that when new sellers or SDRs or BDRs or customer success people join you, that they quickly get up to speed with what it takes to be successful. And then that needs to feed into an ongoing learning and development program because learning never stops. And also it's simply the packaging, right? So you cannot just land the amount of content that it takes to be successful in one role, in one onboarding program. So you have to kind of also be aware of how adults learn, and which, by the way, becomes more and more visual and multimedia nowadays. So you need to have someone who understands those modern ways of actually delivering content. And then on the systems piece, LMS is always kind of one of those neglected topics, but it's actually critical for your success. And having an enablement team and that puts together the story about how the right choice for that tool and platform enables success through the funnel and through all for all the related roles is super important, right? It shouldn't be that, oh, we have an LMS and we almost never use it, or it sucks, which you hear often. It's how do you make the LMS basically a core element of the overall enablement strategy, and which means connecting it to the right processes and also leveraging it, and also building out some storylines about how to best use it together with your users. So the user experience is super important. It needs to be fun to learn, and adding that tagline to everything that enablement does is helpful. So, and then of course, related to that also next point, metrics, right? Let's not forget metrics. They're very, very important for enablement. You want to be able to measure how quickly someone onboards, how well do they engage with ongoing learning and development. What's the feedback? For example, we just ran our December onboarding class. We shared the feedback very transparently across everyone. And we're learning from that. We're taking that in because there's always something to improve, and then making sure that your audience and your internal customers are part of that improvement journey, I think is also a critical element, in particular for enablement.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to add on to metrics, just in terms of building out, what do you measure for all of your teams? Like we talked about earlier, do your marketing metrics lead into your pipeline goals that lead into your revenue goals, connecting those metrics all the way across to that. I think one of the things that sales is guilty of is looking at lagging indicators like revenue closed. And what the thing that we can help with is creating those metrics that help them get ahead and figuring out, are we going in the right direction? And then last thing here from me is working across defined functions. If you don't have a defined revenue operations function, just keep in mind that your revenue stakeholders are marketing, sales development, sales, customer success, business development, professional services. They're all revenue generating organizations. And we've talked about as well, you're going to partner with finance, legal, product, engineering. You're going to build all of these bridges outside of your reporting structure, and being able to work in partnership with all these people will help you to build a revenue operations function regardless of your official organizational chart.
Love it. So look, thank you first of all, Erin and Marcus, for the amazing stories and input throughout. The amount of information you shared was like perfect, because we're right up to the end of the hour here. Sorry, folks, we don't have time for any more questions. But Erin, if people want to ask you questions, how can they get in touch with you?
Easiest way to get in touch with me is probably just on LinkedIn, Erin Bush at LeanData. You'll be able to find me.
And Marcus, same for you?
Same for us and same for me. We love LinkedIn, but you also can send me an email, marcus.benning@outrage.io.
Great. All right. So many takeaways here. Folks, the way that this deck was packaged up, Erin and Marcus didn't, if you noticed, like a good presenter does, they didn't speak to every bullet point. They purposely built this as like a jumping off point or a kind of checklist for you to think about in your journey of building a revenue operations function. Not necessarily that you should build it exactly like they did, but it's a starting point, right? So you can look at what they've done and think about for yourself, how does it map to your needs? So we'll send out this recording and the deck to anybody who registered for the live version. If you want to get in touch with Marcus and Erin, you know how to do that. And I hope to see you at another Sales Hacker webinar really soon. Thanks for coming, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Marcus. Bye, Erin. Thank you.
Bye.